Well, welcome to week 2 of Intro to Youth Ministry. Hopefully, you are making good progress in reading Almost Christian, and also working on iGen. That one, remember, we don't have assigned readings from, but you do have a paper that is due in a couple weeks. So be sure you're working on that. That is kind of your own pace, but you do need to read that book and write that review paper or response paper to it. So don't let that one sneak up on you. But this week we were covering chapters 3 to 5 in Almost Christian. And if you didn't get last week's reading done, make sure you get that as well. So again, this book, Almost Christian, is responding to the results of the NSYR, that study of youth and religion from about 15 years ago, that found that most American teenagers really struggle to articulate anything that could be described as historic Christian faith. Instead, the predominant religion they decided to call moralistic therapeutic deism, which we covered in last week, so I won't go through that again. But these 3 chapters begin to move beyond just the results of the study and start to talk about, okay, what do we do with this? How do we, what are the implications of these findings for youth ministry? And so the first chapter, chapter 3, is dealing, well, first of all, she notes that there are outliers. Not all demographics necessarily have the same results. So conservative Protestants or evangelicals tended to fare a bit better, as did black Protestants, in comparison to Catholics and mainline Protestants and other groups like Jews and of course atheists. You wouldn't expect to be very high on that list. But the one that really stood out the highest was Mormons, and much to the dismay of evangelicals, the Mormons actually show a higher level of piety and understanding of their own tradition among Mormon teenagers than any other religious group. Speaking as a Methodist, United Methodist myself, Mormons are growing. And if current trends continue, they are pretty quickly going to pass up the United Methodists for being the 3rd largest religious group in America, behind Catholics and Southern Baptists. Right now, that's the United Methodist Church. But we're shrinking in the United States, and the Mormons are growing, and they're not that far behind us. So they're doing something right. Even if I disagree with their theology, they are doing something right in terms of how they're training the next generation. But one of the, what I'm going to do these 3 chapters, I'm not going to lecture on them, but I want to just pull out a few things for you to really pay attention to while you're doing your own reading and thinking about the question, the discussion question for this week, which I'll get to in a little bit. One of the things that really you ought to be finding in chapter 3 is where she talks about the idea of a cultural toolkit. So I'll go ahead and read her definition of that. She says, cultural tools are the symbols, stories, rituals, relationships, and worldviews that we pick up from our experience of the world around us, our default operating system, and we use them to construct meaning and to guide our actions in the world. So these are it's the worldview and the sort of intellectual, emotional, spiritual resources that we acquire from our environment, whether that be a religious environment or otherwise, that we use then to cope with the world around us and to interpret the world around us. So it has a lot to do with worldview. It's the prism through which we view the world, and it's also resources we use to cope with the world. So let's say something bad happens, a parent dies or a loved one dies, or you experience some sort of a crisis. The cultural toolkit is, well, what has your experience of the world given you to help you to handle that? It could be smaller things. It could just be life itself, just the challenges of life or life stages. As you grow up and you, let's say, finish school, or you get a job, or you start a family, what's the programming that's been put into you that dictates how you will live your life and how you'll interact with the world around you? That's the toolkit. And so we would expect, right, that religious teens, or people who grew up in a religious environment, would have tools, would have resources that they've acquired from their religious upbringing. And in fact, that's been found to be the case. Highly religious teens have coping skills that non-religious teens don't have. That being religious is actually helpful just from a sociological perspective, or from a psychological perspective, that teens and adults who have religious commitments and are active in a religious community tend to get better grades. They tend to be more emotionally stable. They just have, because they have these tools that they acquire from it. And she said that one of the findings that comes out of the NSYR is that there are 4 tools in the cultural toolkit that we see among highly devoted religious teens. So this is I think she said about the 8% of teens that could be described as highly devoted to their religious tradition. So they're a minority, but they are a minority that is doing it right, or that is that we can kind of hold up as this is what we want to see. And so these 4 tools are, she says, they confess their tradition's creed, so they know what they believe, and they are faithful to their religion's beliefs. 2, they belong to a community that enacts the God story, so they are attached to a vibrant faith community. So that's important. Highly devoted teens, the church is important. They're not Lone Ranger faith. It's not the just me and Jesus, which for me as a pastor makes a lot of sense. That we, in order for us to have vibrant spiritual lives, we need to be connected with the church. It's important. 3, they feel called to contribute to this purpose. So they are, we would say, missional minded. They feel called to contribute to the work of the church and to God's redemptive plan for the world. And 4th, they have hope for a promised future. So they're optimistic, right? They have what I would say an eschatology, right? That God has a plan for the world and a plan for their lives, and they live into that. So as we look at youth ministry, maybe what we want to think about is, what are the tools that we're trying to implant into youth. You don't want, at least for me thinking as a pastor, we don't want our thinking in the church to simply be self-propagation. If the church only exists to perpetuate itself, that we're just an institution that its only goal is just like a business. So this would be the business model is, well, we got to have people coming in, or we got to be growing the church just for institutional survival. That's, there's truth to that. We do have to survive. But hopefully we're motivated by something more than that. Hopefully we're motivated by actually wanting to disciple people. Because this is when I look at these 4 religious tools, what I see is they are being discipled. This is the discipleship process, and so they are becoming Christ-like, and they are living into the mission of the church. So that's important to think about as we move into chapter 4 on generative faith. What is the goal of youth ministry? So she starts out with an analogy. She says, uses the Back to the Future analogy. So in Back to the Future, the flux capacitor is what makes time travel possible. Doc Brown hits his head and has a vision of this device that somehow makes everything work. And the key is, of course, the car's got to be going 88 miles an hour, and it's got to have the 1.21 gigawatts of electricity going through the flux capacitor, and bam, everything works. And she uses this analogy to say, well, we often think about ministry, or in particular youth ministry, as being like a flux capacitor. That as long as we get all the conditions right, as long as we plug in all the right methods and everything, it will guaranteed work, right? That it's an exact science. What do we need to do in our church? Do we have to have a contemporary worship band? Do we have to have this program or that program? What is the thing that we need that once we have it, our youth ministry will take off? And for me, speaking as someone who has worked in youth ministry for a number of years, as a youth pastor, that can be extremely frustrating, because you feel like, well, what am I doing wrong if you're not seeing the results? Or if the church, a lot of times it comes from the church, where they hire a youth pastor and think, well, we did what we need to do. We should guaranteed see results. We supported this ministry. We ought to see kids coming in. But there are a lot of factors that play into that. There is no secret recipe to guaranteeing a successful youth ministry, much as with any church. Now, as a senior pastor, it's not simply about having the right style of music and the right programs and all the right configurations, and as long as you get all the ingredients right, it will turn out exactly right. It doesn't work that way. So this is actually where I want to think about our question for this week. The question, the discipleship, or the discussion question for this week is, here's a question to kind of get started. Is youth ministry about doing things the right way, using the right method to guarantee results? So what I want you to think about for your discussion question is, what is our goal in youth ministry, and how do we measure success in youth ministry? Again, if the flux capacitor, well, it's working, because if everything is done correctly, you go back in time. What is it we're looking for in youth ministry, and how do we get there? I know that seems like a really broad question, and I'll refine that a little bit in the actual discussion question, but this is where it's going to come from, is youth ministry simply defined as doing all the right things, using the right methods to get guaranteed results? And so she uses this to talk a little bit about the idea of catechesis. Catechesis is just a fancy word for religious instruction. A catechism, right, is a manual of doctrine and teaching for people joining a religious community. So she says, well, catechesis helps to build and grow mature faith. It gives teens the cultural toolkits that they need. And she says it perhaps makes mature faith more likely, but it doesn't guarantee faith. And the simple reason for that is because only the Holy Spirit can ignite faith. It's to say that you can do everything right, and at the end of the day, it's not you put all the right numbers in and you'll guaranteed to get the right answer. You're dealing with people, and you're dealing with the Holy Spirit. And so we are, but as Paul says in 1 Corinthians, one person plants, another person waters, but it's God who gives the growth. And so we are tools that God uses, but we are not in control of that whole process. So think about that in terms of our discussion question for this week. 5th chapter is on a very interesting topic called missional translation. versus conquest. Translation. So we talk about religious translation is not language. It's thought. It's concepts. It's ideas. The idea is that to communicate the Christian faith, we have to use language, and we have to use imagery and symbols and sacraments and things like that that make sense to people around us, that makes sense to the community, makes sense to the audience, if you will. And Jewish and Christian communities, the Jewish and early Christian communities in the first century and around that era, were constantly in this negotiation process of translating the faith for a Hellenistic, Roman, pagan culture to make it understandable to them. And even the Bible itself is a product of that translation. In the Old Testament, if you get into comparative studies of Israelite and ancient Near Eastern culture, you find that much of the Old Testament is borrowing language and imagery and themes and motifs from Babylonian and Egyptian and Canaanite mythology and religion and culture, and it's using those to communicate something about their theology to the recipient. So an example of that would be in Genesis, in Genesis 1 through 11. So I've published an article on this, that you have this common ancient Near Eastern mythological motif of culture as being a product of divine origin, that either the gods create civilization, including like certain technologies and city building and all those marks of high culture, that it's either created by the gods and simply given to humanity, or that the gods give humans the knowledge necessary to do it. Something called the maze, M-E. Looks like me, but it's pronounced May. That it's bestowed upon humanity. In the Sumerian king list, we read that kingship came down from heaven and was given to, there's the siren, cue the siren. It was given to humanity as a gift, and that allowed them to develop civilization. But in Genesis 1 through 11, we actually see much the opposite. The development of high culture and civilization is pretty consistently portrayed negatively. For example, in Genesis 4, the descendants of Cain are said to have developed a number of technologies like animal husbandry and metallurgy and music. But this line is filled with murderous thugs. And so there's this implication that, yeah, all these civilizations like the Babylonians that have all this technology and this culture, but they're actually sinful. So there's a connection there, sort of a pushback, a polemic against that high culture. You see this especially when you get to Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel story, where the urbanism, the building of this city with this tower, which is of course Babylon, Babel is Babylon, is an act of defiance and rebellion against God. And here they turn that on its head. Now in Babylonian language, in Akkadian, the word Bab-Elu, which is the name of Babylon, it means gate of God. But in Genesis 11, there's a different etymology given to that word. Bavel is a pun, it's a play on the word Balal, which means to mix up, confuse. And so the idea is that, well, God confused their language there. So Babylon, rather than being a symbol of divine knowledge, the pathway to God, the gate of God, it's now a symbol of confusion. And if you go back to Genesis 3, I think we see the roots of all of that is that in Genesis 3, in the Garden of Eden, humans acquire knowledge, but they do so illicitly. The knowledge of good and evil. is ultimately what allows them to do all this, but it's tainted, it's corrupt. All right. So what they're doing there, for people who were familiar with all this mythology, they would have read Genesis 1 through 11 and seen it communicating with and polemicizing against much of their worldview. So sometimes it's polemical, sometimes it's actually more positive. For example, in the first century, there was a Jew named Philo of Alexandria, and he was a Hellenist. He lived in Alexandria, Egypt. He was a sort of the Jewish Plato or the Jewish Aristotle, and so he was trying to translate Judaism into into sort of Greek thought, to put it in terms that were reminiscent of the Greek philosophers. And so he would argue that, say, well, Moses was the first philosopher, and really all this stuff that Socrates and Plato and Aristotle were teaching, really it all came from Moses. So we are sort of the source of your intellectual tradition. But he's saying, hey, guess what? Greeks and Jews, we're a lot alike. We believe a lot of the same things, because he's trying to translate their religion and their culture into a Greek paradigm. We see the same thing actually in Acts 17. This is Paul in Athens, and read that chapter. But in Acts 17, Paul's in Athens, and he points to the idols all around all around him, and he finds one to an unknown god, and he says, "Oh well, you Greeks, you're worshiping in ignorance the one true God. The God you don't know is the real God." And so he taps into something in their own religious practice to say, you have a little bit of truth. Now I'm going to tell you the rest of it. We see the same thing later on in the church in the 2nd century with Justin Martyr, his first apology. He wrote 2 of these, but apology, think apologetics. He was defending the Christian faith to Greco-Roman society, and he argued that, much like what Philo argued, that Christians really believe the same things that your great philosophers believed. They believe in the one true God. They even call him the same thing. They called him the Logos. Think John 1. And so he's arguing that Christianity is highly compatible with Greek culture and Roman culture as long as you properly understand it. So he's putting it into their terms. Well, in a lot of ways, that's what we do in youth ministry, or really in all of ministry. Pastors, we do this as well. We're trying to take a 2,000-year-old faith and communicate it in meaningful ways to people living in the 21st century. And that's a difficult task. That's what preaching is. We could just stand up there and just read the Bible and say, well, there it is, right? It's in black and white. It says what it says. The idea of a sermon, of course, is, well, people need you to explain that. They need you to exegete it, bring the meaning out of this text. Help me to understand what it's trying to say across the centuries. So that involves, making connections with our culture. It involves illustrating things. It involves putting things in other words, finding ways to communicate things. With youth, it simply means we're trying to do the same thing with a new generation. And that's harder. Because usually, unless you're very young as a youth pastor, you're probably going to be trying to communicate to a different generation than your own. Now, when I started out in youth ministry, I was not that far off. And I know some of you, Matt in particular, not that far off in age from the people that you're ministering to. But that won't last, right? That's why youth ministers don't tend to last very long. We get into our 30s, and suddenly, once we're more than about 10 years removed in age from the teens, it gets a lot harder to communicate and speak their language. But that is the goal. So it involves a knowledge of both. Just like in translating a language, you have to know both languages, right? If I'm going to translate something from, let's say, Hebrew into English, it's because I know both languages. So that's part of why I want you to read a book like iGen, to try to understand youth culture today so you can speak their language and communicate the gospel to them. That's the act of translation. All right. Another way of describing this is incarnational. So Dean talks about incarnational ministry with youth. That's the way God communicates to us. God is incarnational, and so the sort of the highest example of that is the incarnation of Jesus. In order for God to reach humanity, God became a human. You see much the same thing. It's in I believe it's in 1 Corinthians 9, I think, where Paul says, to the Jews I become like a Jew, to the Gentiles I become a Gentile, become all things to all people. All right, that's incarnational ministry, getting down in there with them. So that means, hey, when I was a youth pastor, guess what I was doing? I was playing hide and seek in the church with kids. I was, playing video games with them. I was immersing myself in their culture in order to communicate to them. All right. So those are some things to watch for in these 3 chapters. And then make sure you do the discussion questions which I'll be putting up here shortly. And I'll leave you to that.